He was Alistair Finch, a name that echoed with the force of a billion-dollar dynasty. From the gleaming towers of Manhattan to the tech hubs of Silicon Valley, his word was gospel. When he told the world his wife Catherine was losing her mind, the world listened. He painted a tragic portrait of a woman lost in a fantasy, a fragile beauty needing his protection. The whispers grew into headlines, all orchestrated by a man who controlled everything. But he made one fatal miscalculation. He never imagined that inside the gilded cage he had so carefully constructed his wife was taking notes. And he never ever thought her lawyer would dare to turn the spotlight back on him. What came next wasn't just a divorce. It was a reckoning. The lie, when it first bloomed, was as delicate and beautiful as the orchids Alistair Finch cultivated in the climate-controlled conservatory of their Greenwich, Connecticut estate. It was a masterpiece of insinuation whispered into the right ears at the right moments. Alistair Finch didn't just occupy space, he commanded it. As the founder and CEO of Aura Dynamics, a tech behemoth that had seamlessly integrated its software into the very fabric of modern life, he was more than a billionaire. He was a visionary, a prophet of the digital age. His face, a study in severe, handsome lines, graced the covers of Forbes and Wired. His pronouncements on the future of artificial intelligence were treated as scripture. And when he spoke of his wife, Catherine, a new somber tone entered his voice. It was a tone of profound, weary sadness. To the outside world, Catherine Finch was an ethereal figure. She was the beautiful raven-haired woman at his side on red carpets draped in couture, her smile a quiet counterpoint to his booming confidence. They were the ultimate power couple. But within the 30-acre high-security walls of their estate, known as the Haven, Catherine was living in a soundproof prison. The campaign began subtly. It started with a concerned aside to their inner circle at a charity gala held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Catherine's been a bit fragile lately, Alistair would murmur to a board member, his hand resting on the small of his wife's back, in a gesture that looked like affection, but was in fact a vice. She has these flights of fancy, wonderful of course, but not always tethered to reality. Then came the carefully curated anecdotes, leaked with surgical precision to gossip columnists who owed him favors. There was the story of Catherine's profligate spending a multi-million-dollar purchase of a Mark Rothko painting. The story conveniently omitted that Alistair had not only promised her the painting for their 10th anniversary, but had bid against her through a proxy at the Sotheby's auction, driving the price up to create a more sensational headline. There was the tale of her increasing paranoia. A trusted housekeeper, Maria was abruptly fired. The official story, leaked by Alistair's PR team, was that Catherine had accused the poor woman of being a corporate spy. The truth was that Maria had witnessed Alistair in a fit of rage smash a tablet computer against a marble column and had asked Catherine if she was all right. Maria was a witness, and Alistair did not tolerate witnesses. The most damning story was that she had begun talking to herself, wandering the vast manicured gardens of the Haven in long, rambling monologues. This was the cornerstone of his narrative of her descent. The reality was that Catherine, a former art history scholar from Yale, had been invited to give a keynote address at a symposium on Renaissance patronage. She had been ecstatic working on her speech for weeks, practicing it aloud amongst the rose bushes that were her only confidants. 2 days before the event, Alistair had informed her that they would be flying to Tokyo on urgent business for Aura Dynamics. He had watched his face a mask of detached concern as her spirit crumpled. The trip, of course, was later cancelled due to a sudden logistical issue. Alistair was a master of gaslighting an artist who painted a distorted reality, and then berated Catherine for not seeing it his way. "You're misremembering, darling," he'd say with a patient sigh, his voice smooth as velvet. "I never said you could go to the symposium. You've been under so much stress, your memory is playing tricks on you." He would delete emails, alter calendar appointments on their shared server, and then present the doctored evidence as proof of her confusion. He controlled every facet of her existence. Her credit cards were in his name. The staff reported to him. Her calls were monitored, her emails screened by his personal assistant under the guise of security protocols. He had weaned her off her old friends, subtly criticizing them, creating small imagined slights until Catherine, exhausted and confused, retreated from them. Her family, who lived in California, were kept at a distance by tales of Catherine's delicate state and her unwillingness to travel. The final act of this meticulously staged play began when Alistair's lawyers from the formidable New York firm of Sterling, Cromwell and Knight formally filed a petition for conservatorship. The document was a brutal work of fiction, citing her erratic behavior, financial recklessness, and inability to care for her own well-being. It requested that Alistair be granted full legal control over her person and her assets that were according to the prenuptial agreement he had forced upon her, almost entirely his. The legal documents, leaked to the New York Post, became a sensation. The headline screamed, "Billionaire seeks to save his troubled bride." The accompanying photo showed Alistair looking stoic and burdened, while a paparazzi shot of Catherine, caught blinking in the harsh flash of a camera, made her look wild and disoriented. In the cavernous, echoing elegance of their marble-floored mansion, Catherine read the news on a tablet left carelessly on the breakfast table. The words blurred before her eyes. He wasn't just divorcing her. He was erasing her. He was crafting a public narrative that would not only strip her of her dignity and freedom, but would also invalidate her reality, her sanity, her very self. He was claiming she was mentally unfit, and in the gilded cage he had built with the whole world, watching and applauding his compassionate concern. Catherine felt a cold, terrifying thought crystallize in her mind. He was going to win. For weeks, Catherine felt like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. The haven, once a symbol of her fairy tale marriage, now felt like an opulent asylum. The hushed footsteps of the new staff, all hired by Alistair's security chief, seemed to track her every move. The landscape gardeners outside no longer met her gaze. She was a non-person, a problem to be managed. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her bedroom suite. Alistair had moved into a separate wing of the mansion, a move his lawyers spun as a necessary precaution, given Catherine's unpredictable episodes. In reality, it was the final act of isolation. He communicated only through his assistants, or with curt, dismissive remarks when they passed in the grand hallway. "Did you take your medication?" He'd ask, his voice loud enough for the nearby staff to hear, knowing full well the medication was nothing more than vitamin supplements prescribed by a doctor on his payroll. Every detail was a weapon against her. The Rothko painting she adored now hung in his private study, a monument to her supposed extravagance. When her brother Robert called from San Francisco, frantic after reading the news, the call was strangely disconnected. An hour later, Alistair's assistant emailed Robert from Catherine's account, explaining that she was feeling overwhelmed and needed space, but appreciated his concern. Catherine saw the sent email later, a digital dagger in her back. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waking up to damning headlines on the internet, picking at food she had no appetite for, and staring at the walls of her cage. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, amplifying the voice in her head that was starting to whisper in terrified agreement with Alistair. Was she going crazy? Had she imagined his promises? Was her memory truly so faulty? This was Alistair's true genius. He didn't just break your spirit. He made you complicit in the breaking. He made you doubt the evidence of your own senses until you had no ground left to stand on. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a quiet, calculated cruelty. Catherine had always sponsored the education of 2 children in a small village in Guatemala through a charity she'd been involved with before her marriage. It was her one remaining link to a world outside Alistair's control. The annual payment was made automatically from a small trust fund her grandmother had left her. One afternoon, she received a heartbreaking email from the charity coordinator. The payment had been declined. She tried to log into her online banking portal. Access denied. She tried the private credit card she kept for exactly these purposes. It was cancelled. She was penniless. The last vestige of her autonomy, the ability to help 2 children thousands of miles away, had been severed. It was a small amount of money to a man like Alistair, but its symbolism was immense. He was telling her that she didn't even own herself enough to perform a single act of kindness. That night, something inside Catherine shifted. The fear which had been a cold, paralyzing fog began to harden into a diamond-sharp point of anger. She looked at her reflection in the dark expanse of the bulletproof window. The woman staring back was pale, thin, and haunted. But her eyes, for the first time in months, held a spark of fire. He had taken everything. Her home, her reputation, her friends, her money, and very nearly her mind. He had left her with nothing to lose. She remembered a name from a life that felt a century ago. Isabella Rossi. They had been roommates at Yale, an unlikely pairing. Catherine, the reserved art history major, and Isabella, the fiery political science debater, who seemed destined to argue before the Supreme Court. They had lost touch as people do, but Catherine had followed Isabella's career from a distance. Isabella had become a lawyer not at a slick corporate firm, but at a small, scrappy boutique practice in New York City, known for taking on impossible cases and fighting for the disenfranchised. She specialized in family law, specifically cases involving powerful, abusive spouses. Getting to her was the problem. Catherine had no phone Alistair didn't monitor, no car he didn't track. But Alistair had made one mistake. He had underestimated the loyalty he thought he could buy. The previous housekeeper, Maria, had been more than an employee. She had been a friend, before she was fired. Seeing the storm that was gathering, Maria had slipped Catherine a cheap prepaid burner phone, hiding it at the bottom of a box of old winter clothes in a remote storage closet. For an emergency, Cathy, she had whispered, "When you need to call a real friend." That night at 2 a.m., when the entire estate was asleep and the security patrols were at the far end of the property, Catherine retrieved the phone. Her hands trembled as she punched in the number for Isabella Rossi's firm, which she had memorized from their website. It went to a 24-hour answering service. She left a cryptic, desperate message. "This is Catherine Reed," she said, using her maiden name. "I was a friend of Isabella's at Yale. I need her help. It's an emergency. Please tell her the ghost from Grace Hopper College needs to speak to a dragon." It was an old, silly nickname from their college days. If Isabella remembered, she would know it was real. 2 hours later, the burner phone vibrated. An unknown number. Catherine answered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Cutty," a voice said, sharp and clear and blessedly familiar. "Is that you? What the hell is going on? I've been reading the papers. It's all lies, isn't it?" Tears streamed down Catherine's face, hot and swollen. For the first time in years, she felt the anchor of an undisputed reality. "Yes, Isa," she choked out. "It's all lies." "Okay," Isabella said, her voice shifting from concerned friend to focused professional. "Don't say anything else. Not a word. They are probably listening to you right now somehow. We need to get you out of there." "No, wait. That's what he wants. He wants you to run to look unstable. We're going to do this my way. Stay put. Act broken. Let him think he's winning. I'm coming for you, Cutty, and I'm bringing hell with me." The first meeting with Alistair's legal team felt less like a preliminary hearing and more like an imperial coronation. It took place in a vast wood-paneled conference room at the offices of Sterling, Cromwell and Knight in Midtown Manhattan, a space designed to intimidate. The air was thick with the scent of old money leather and predatory confidence. At the head of a polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch for a mile sat Alistair, looking every inch the concerned husband. He was flanked by a trio of lawyers led by the legendary Wallace Sterling III himself, a silver-haired shark in a $3,000 suit, whose courtroom victories were the stuff of legal folklore. They were the juggernaut. On the other side of the table sat Catherine. Next to her was Isabella Rossi. Compared to the Sterling, Cromwell and Knight machine, Isabella was a study in controlled defiance. She wore a simple, perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She radiated an aura of ferocious intelligence that the polished corporate lawyers across the table clearly underestimated. They saw her as a boutique firm nuisance, an annoyance to be swatted away. Wallace Sterling began, his voice a rich, patronizing baritone. "Ms. Rossi, we're all here with Catherine's best interests at heart. My client, Mr. Finch, is deeply concerned. We've compiled a significant file, psychiatric evaluations, witness statements, financial records that paints a very clear picture. We're hoping to resolve this matter quickly and quietly to avoid any further public distress for Catherine." He slid a thick binder across the table. "We are proposing a settlement. A generous one. A private medical facility, the best in the country. A substantial trust will be established for her long-term care. In return for her agreement to the conservatorship, Mr. Finch will ensure she wants for nothing." It was a gilded key offered with a condescending smile. They weren't negotiating. They were dictating terms of surrender. Isabella didn't open the binder. She simply pushed it back across the table. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice calm and even, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "My client is not for sale, and she is not mentally incompetent. Therefore, we will not be entertaining any discussion of a conservatorship." Alistair flinched, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before being replaced by his mask of sorrow. Wallace Sterling chuckled a dry, humorless sound. "Ms. Rossi, with all due respect, you are not a medical professional. We have 2 separate evaluations from highly respected psychiatrists, Dr. Alan Grant and Dr. Lydia Cole." Isabella countered, her tone sharp. "Dr. Grant has been on the Aura Dynamics Corporate Health Advisory Board for 6 years, and Lydia Cole received a very generous donation to her private research foundation from a subsidiary of Mr. Finch's company just 3 months ago. Their reports are not independent evaluations. They are paid-for opinions. We will be challenging their validity in court. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Sterling's smile tightened. He had not expected her to have done that level of homework. "My client is a public figure, Ms. Rossi," he parried smoothly. He and his companies support many philanthropic and scientific endeavors. To imply a conflict of interest is not only insulting, it's libelous. "The facts will speak for themselves," Isabella said. She then turned her gaze directly to Alistair, who had remained silent, observing the exchange like a king watching a joust. "Mr. Finch, Catherine will not be agreeing to your petition. She will be filing a counter-petition for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty and coercive control." Alistair's mask finally cracked. He leaned forward, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Coercive control? That's absurd. I have given Catherine everything she could ever want. You have given her objects. Mr. Finch?" Isabella retorted, her voice like ice. "You have taken her agency, her friends, her family, her reputation, and her peace of mind. You have systematically dismantled her life and her identity to suit your own narrative. That isn't love. It's tyranny." The battle lines were drawn. In the weeks that followed, Alistair's legal machine went into overdrive. They filed a barrage of motions. A motion to have Catherine submit to yet another psychiatric exam, this time by a doctor of their choosing. A motion to seal all financial records, preventing Isabella from digging into the very accounts Alistair had used to control his wife. A motion to have Catherine's frivolous counter-petition for divorce thrown out. The media assault was relentless. Anonymous sources clearly fed by Alistair's camp provided a steady stream of stories to tabloids and news sites. One headline read, "Catherine Finch's cruelty claim, a desperate ploy by a woman scorned." Another featured a paparazzi photo of Isabella captioned, "The dragon lawyer, is she fighting for justice or a payday?" They tried to bury Isabella and Catherine under an avalanche of paperwork and public scorn. The preliminary hearings were brutal. Judge Harrison, the presiding judge, was an older traditional man who seemed openly skeptical of Isabella's claims and deferential to Wallace Sterling and his famous client. He granted Alistair's motion to seal the financials a major blow to Catherine's case. Alistair was confident, almost smug. He was winning just as he always did. He watched Catherine in the courtroom, expecting to see her crumble under the pressure. She looked pale and fragile. Yes, but she held her head high, her eyes fixed on Isabella. There was a resolve in her that he hadn't seen in years. It was unnerving. The most critical hearing was on their motion to compel Catherine to undergo a third psychiatric exam and to be temporarily hospitalized for observation for her own safety. Sterling argued passionately, citing the reports from his paid-for doctors and the leaked stories as evidence of her deteriorating state. "Your Honor," Sterling concluded, his voice resonating with grave concern, "we are trying to help Mrs. Finch. Her lawyer's combative stance is only harming her. We must insist on this evaluation to understand the depth of her condition and provide the care she so desperately needs." Judge Harrison looked at Catherine with pity. He seemed poised to grant the motion. It was the moment Alistair had been waiting for, the final public validation of his story. The checkmate. Isabella Rossi stood up. She held a single slim file in her hands. She had been waiting for this exact moment of maximum arrogance from the other side. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "we object to this motion. But we would also like to file a motion of our own. The air in the Stamford Superior Courthouse was stale with anticipation. Judge Harrison, looking down from his bench, was visibly impatient. He saw a powerful, concerned husband and a combative young lawyer leading her fragile client down a path of public humiliation. A motion of your own? Ms. Rosie the judge asked, an edge of weariness in his voice. I hope this has some bearing on the matter at hand, namely, Mrs. Finch's immediate health and safety. It has every bearing on it. Your Honor, Isabella said, her gaze unwavering. Mr. Sterling and his client have built their entire case for conservatorship on the premise that my client, Mrs. Finch, is suffering from delusions, paranoia, and a detachment from reality. They claim her perceptions are distorted. She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Wallace Sterling shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance on his face. This was all preamble. We contend, Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength, that Mrs. Finch's emotional state, whatever it may be, is not the product of an inherent mental illness. It is in fact a perfectly rational and predictable response to prolonged psychological distress. It is a reaction to a hostile and manipulative environment. She took a step forward, placing the slim file on the counsel table. The petition against my client lists her delusional belief that she is being constantly monitored. It cites her paranoia that her staff were spies. It details her irrational conviction that her husband is actively working to undermine her. But, Your Honor, what if those beliefs are not delusions? What if they are accurate assessments of her reality? Alastair Finch, sitting at the plaintiff's table, gave a small theatrical shake of his head, a gesture of sorrowful disbelief for the judge to see. Before this court considers stripping a woman of her fundamental rights, based on the opinions of two financially compromised psychiatrists, Isabella declared, her voice ringing with conviction. We believe the court must first examine the source of the alleged distress. We must examine the environment and the individual who created it. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his interest finally piqued. Get to the point, Counselor. Isabella took a deep breath. This was the moment, the point of no return. Therefore, Your Honor, we are formally filing a motion to compel an independent court-ordered psychiatric evaluation of the petitioner, himself, Mr. Alastair Finch. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keys for a split second. Wallace Sterling shot to his feet, his face a mask of crimson outrage. Objection. Your Honor, this is outrageous. It's an absurd, vindictive, and baseless tactic. It's nothing more than harassment. My client's mental state is not in question here. On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, it is the only question, Isabella fired back, turning to face him. For 10 years, Catherine Finch has been a model wife philanthropist and community member. The symptoms you allege have only appeared under the immense pressure of my client's husband's increasingly erratic and controlling behavior. You cannot diagnose the fish as sick without examining the toxicity of the water it's swimming in. Mr. Finch is the water. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, in family law, particularly in cases involving allegations of abuse, the mental state and personality of both parties are critically relevant. We allege that Mr. Finch exhibits classic and extreme traits of narcissistic personality disorder, including a pathological need for control, a lack of empathy, and persecutory delusions which he projects onto his wife. His actions, the constant surveillance, the isolation of Catherine from her support system, the gaslighting, the public smear campaign are not the actions of a concerned husband. They are the actions of a textbook abuser. Alistair was no longer acting. His handsome face was contorted in a sneer of pure fury. The mask of the benevolent billionaire had not just slipped, it had shattered. He glared at Catherine, a look of such venomous hatred that several people in the gallery visibly recoiled. "She's the one who's sick," he snarled, his voice dangerously loud. Forgetting the courtroom decorum, "Look at her. I gave her the world, and she's trying to destroy me with these pathetic lies." Wallace Sterling put a restraining hand on his client's arm. His own composure rattled. "Alistair, be quiet." But the damage was done. The outburst, so starkly contrasting with his carefully crafted image, hung in the air. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed, not at Isabella, but at Alistair Finch. For the first time, he saw a crack in the billionaire's polished facade. Isabella pressed her advantage. His outburst, "Your Honor," is just a small glimpse. We have evidence. We have testimony from the former housekeeper, Maria Torres, who was fired for witnessing Mr. Finch's violent temper. We have communications showing his deliberate sabotage of my client's professional engagement. We believe a thorough psychiatric evaluation will reveal a pattern of behavior that will completely recontextualize every single claim made against Mrs. Finch. Wallace Sterling, recovering, tried to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, this is a desperate fishing expedition. They have no grounds." The grounds, Isabella concluded, her voice now quiet but firm, are that a person's sanity is being judged. We are simply asking that the court be allowed to see the full picture. If Mr. Finch is the stable, loving husband he claims to be, what does he have to fear from an evaluation by an impartial expert? If he refuses, what does that tell the court? The question was a perfectly laid trap. Judge Harrison looked from a furious Alistair to a resolute Isabella, and then to Catherine, who sat still and silent, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He was a traditional man, but he was also a fair one. He had been on the verge of signing away this woman's freedom. Isabella Rossi's argument, as audacious as it was, had introduced a sliver of doubt, a sliver that now demanded to be examined. "I will take this motion under advisement, Judge Harrison," said his voice now devoid of its earlier impatience. "I will also table your motion to compel Mr. Sterling pending my decision. We are adjourned." He banged the gavel. As Alistair was hustled out of the courtroom by his lawyers, he shot one last look at Catherine. It was a promise of retribution. But for the first time, in a very long time, Catherine didn't flinch. She had found her voice, and it was the voice of a dragon named Isabella Rossi. The gambit had been played. Now they could only wait to see if it would pay off. The news that Judge Harrison had granted Isabella's motion landed like a seismic shock. Alistair Finch, the titan of tech, the master of the universe, was to submit to a full independent psychiatric evaluation. His legal team had fought it furiously, appealing the decision and arguing that it would cause irreparable harm to Aura Dynamics' stock value. But the judge, his curiosity now fully engaged, held firm. He stipulated, however, that the psychiatrist would be a neutral party chosen from a list provided by the State Bar Association and agreed upon by both sides. The man selected was Dr. Marcus Thorne. He was, in every sense of the word, unshakable. Nearing retirement, Dr. Thorne had a sterling reputation for being meticulous, impartial, and utterly unimpressed by wealth or power. His office was not a lavish Park Avenue suite, but a modest book-lined set of rooms in a pre-war building filled with academic journals and the quiet authority of a man who had seen every facet of the human psyche. Alistair arrived for his first session, like a conquering hero arriving in a vassal state. He swept in, flanked by 2 lawyers, and immediately began to take charge of the room. He commented on the quaintness of the office, offered Dr. Thorne investment advice, and spoke about the immense pressures of running a global enterprise. It was a classic display of dominance and control. Dr. Thorne simply listened, his face impassive behind his spectacles, making sparse notes on a legal pad. He let Alistair perform for a full 20 minutes before he spoke. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your lawyers are not needed for this session. Our time is confidential and protected by court order. Please ask them to wait outside." Alistair was visibly taken aback. He was not used to being given orders. After a moment's hesitation and a nod from his lead counsel, the lawyers departed, leaving the billionaire alone with the quiet, unassuming doctor. Now Dr. Thorne began. "Let's talk about your wife." Alistair launched into his well-rehearsed narrative. Catherine was fragile, brilliant, but broken. He loved her dearly, but her grip on reality had been slipping for years. He recounted the incidents, the Rothko painting the fired housekeeper, the monologues in the garden, all with a deep, convincing sorrow. Dr. Thorne listened patiently. Then he began to ask questions. They were not the questions Alistair had prepared for. "Mr. Finch, you mentioned the painting was for your anniversary. Can you show me any correspondence where you discussed this with your wife prior to the auction?" "Well, no," Alistair said. "It was meant to be a surprise. My gesture was misunderstood." "I see. Regarding the housekeeper, Maria Torres. Your petition states she was a corporate spy. What evidence did you have of this?" "She was asking questions, prying. It was a security risk. In my position, you can't be too careful. Did you file a police report or conduct a formal investigation?" "I handled it internally." Alistair clipped his patience, beginning to fray. Dr. Thorne made a note. "And when your wife was practicing her speech for the art symposium, a speech you later prevented her from giving, were you aware of what she was doing? I saw her talking to herself. It was alarming. But did you ask her what she was talking about?" A long silence. I was concerned for her state of mind, not the content of her ramblings. Over the course of 5 sessions, Dr. Thorne meticulously dismantled Alistair's reality. He didn't challenge him directly. He simply asked for specifics, for evidence, for corroboration. And with each session, the cracks in Alistair's facade widened. The billionaire's narcissism was profound. He spoke of his own achievements in grandiose terms, comparing his creation of aura dynamics to the invention of the printing press. He showed a stunning lack of empathy, describing Catherine's emotional distress not in terms of her pain, but in terms of how it inconvenienced him and threatened his public image. The paranoia Isabella had alleged became starkly apparent. Alistair was obsessed with security, loyalty, and betrayal. He revealed that the Haven was wired with a state-of-the-art surveillance system, including audio recording devices in every room, even the master bedroom. He justified it as necessary for a man of his stature. "Is your wife aware that you record her private conversations?" Mr. Finch, Dr. Thorne, asked calmly. "It's a blanket security measure. It's for her protection as much as mine," Alistair rationalized, not seeing the trap. The doctor also explored Alistair's past. He learned of a childhood marked by a demanding, emotionally distant father who was also a powerful CEO. Alistair spoke of his father, not with affection, but with a competitive fire, detailing how he had surpassed the old man's success. He had learned from a young age that love and approval were conditional, tied directly to power and achievement. Vulnerability was a fatal flaw. In the fourth session, Alistair began to unravel. Dr. Thorne was questioning him about a specific business deal where Alistair had ruthlessly pushed out his original partner. He was weak. Alistair spat his composure, finally breaking. He didn't have the vision. The company would have failed. I did what was necessary. Some reports from that time suggest your partner felt betrayed that you used personal information against him to force him out. He was a liability, Alistair shouted, rising from his chair. His face was red, his fists clenched. Everyone is a liability. You have to cut out the weakness before it spreads, whether it's in the boardroom or in your own home. You think, I don't know what this is. She sent you. She and that bitch of a lawyer are trying to tear down everything I've built. They're trying to make me look like the crazy one. He paced the room, his movements agitated and predatory. The calm, controlled billionaire was gone, replaced by a cornered, raging tyrant. He ranted for 10 minutes about conspiracies, about disloyalty, about how everyone was trying to take what was his. Dr. Thorne remained perfectly still, his pen moving steadily across the page. He was no longer just observing the cracks. He was staring directly into the abyss of Alistair Finch's psyche. In their final session, Alistair was subdued, clearly having been coached by his lawyers to be on his best behavior. He apologized for his outburst, blaming it on stress. But it was too late. Dr. Thorne had seen the real man. His final report was a masterpiece of clinical precision and devastating insight. It ran for over 50 pages. He did not use inflammatory language, but the cold medical terminology was far more damning. He diagnosed Alistair Finch with severe narcissistic personality disorder, with comorbid paranoid and obsessive-compulsive traits. He detailed the pathological need for control, the profound lack of empathy, and the tendency to project his own persecutory delusions onto those around him, particularly his wife. The report systematically reframed every one of Catherine's symptoms. Her paranoia was not a delusion, but a justified fear response to covert surveillance. Her detachment was a psychological defense mechanism known as dissociation, common in victims of long-term emotional abuse. Her financial recklessness was an instance of manufactured evidence as part of a campaign of gaslighting. The report's conclusion was unequivocal. While Mrs. Finch is clearly suffering from significant emotional distress consistent with complex PTSD, this condition appears to be a direct result of the toxic marital environment created by Mr. Finch's untreated personality disorder. The petitioner's own psychological state, not the respondent's, is the primary driver of the conflict and instability in this relationship. To grant him conservatorship over his wife would be the psychological equivalent of putting the arsonist in charge of the fire department. The report was sealed and sent to Judge Harrison, with copies delivered simultaneously to Isabella Rossi and Wallace Sterling. In her office, Isabella read it and allowed herself a small, grim smile. In his, Wallace Sterling read it and felt a cold dread creep into his heart. The juggernaut had just hit a wall of solid granite. The A-bomb was ready to drop. The day the contents of Dr. Thorne's report were to be discussed in court, the atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was packed. The press smelling blood in the water filled every available seat in the gallery. This was no longer just a high-stakes divorce. It was a public dissection of a man who had styled himself a king. Alistair Finch strode in his face a carefully composed mask of indifference. He was flanked by a nervous Wallace Sterling, whose usual swagger had been replaced by a tense, brittle energy. They had read the report. They knew what was coming, but they were determined to discredit it, to paint Dr. Thorne as a biased hack, and the report as inadmissible character assassination. Catherine entered from the other side, with Isabella Rossi at her side. She looked different. The haunted, fragile look was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. She met Alistair's gaze across the courtroom, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a profound and sorrowful resolution. Judge Harrison entered his face stern. We are here today to discuss the findings of the court-ordered psychiatric evaluation of the petitioner, Mr. Alistair Finch. I have read Dr. Thorne's report in its entirety. It is extensive. Wallace Sterling immediately rose. Your Honor. Before we proceed, we must move to have this entire report struck from the record. It is prejudicial, speculative, and constitutes an unprecedented and unwarranted invasion of my client's privacy. Dr. Thorne has clearly overstepped his mandate, delving into my client's business practices and personal history that have no bearing on this case. He was hired to evaluate Mr. Finch, not to psychoanalyze his entire life and author a work of fiction. Isabella stood. Your Honor, Dr. Thorne did exactly what he was asked to do. He examined the petitioner's personality and behavior to determine if they could be the source of my client's distress. The report is not speculative. It is a clinical diagnosis based on 5 extensive sessions, supported by Mr. Finch's own words and actions. It is not only relevant, it is the key that unlocks this entire case. The judge looked at Sterling. Your motion to strike is denied, Counselor. I find the report to be thorough, professional, and directly pertinent to the central question of this petition. We will proceed. Sterling sat down, his face grim. Plan A had failed. Ms. Rossi, the judge, continued, since this evaluation was a result of your motion. Perhaps you would like to highlight the sections you find most salient. This was the moment. Isabella walked to the lectern, the 50-page report open before her. The courtroom was dead silent. Thank you, Your Honor, she began. I would first draw the court's attention to page 27, where Dr. Thorne details Mr. Finch's justification for the comprehensive audio and video surveillance system installed throughout his private residence. She read aloud, Mr. Finch stated that the surveillance was a blanket security measure. When asked if his wife was aware that her private phone calls, her conversations with staff, and even moments of solitude in her own bedroom were being recorded, he stated, it's for her protection. He showed no understanding that this constituted a profound violation of privacy, but rather saw it as his right as the provider of that home. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The benevolent protector now sounded like a Stasi agent. Further on page 34, in discussing my client's alleged paranoia, Isabella continued, her voice clear and measured. Dr. Thorne concludes Mrs. Finch's belief that she was being monitored was not a paranoid delusion. It was a fact. Her fear was not a symptom of illness, but a rational response to an environment of absolute surveillance. She turned a page. Regarding the cornerstone of the petitioner's case that my client is detached from reality, Dr. Thorne's analysis of the gaslighting campaign is revealing. Page 41. Mr. Finch admitted to, and in fact seemed proud of his ability to control the flow of information to his wife. He described altering schedules, deleting correspondence, and then presenting the doctored reality as fact. He referred to this as managing her perceptions for her own good, This is not management. It is a deliberate, systematic effort to induce cognitive dissonance and psychological instability in the subject. It is a form of severe emotional abuse. Alistair's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of his table. His calm facade was crumbling under the clinical, dispassionate weight of Dr. Thorne's words. Isabella saved the most devastating part for last. Finally, Your Honor. The diagnosis on page 48. Dr. Thorne identifies the petitioner as suffering from malignant narcissism, a syndrome characterized by narcissism, antisocial behavior, paranoia, and aggression. He writes, and I quote, "Mr. Finch perceives other people, including his wife, not as human beings with their own needs and realities, but as objects to be managed and controlled for the enhancement of his own self-esteem and power. His petition for conservatorship is, in my clinical opinion, not a gesture of concern, but the ultimate act of control, an attempt to have his wife legally declared an object, thereby validating his own pathological worldview." She closed the report. He claimed she was mentally unfit. The truth is, he required her to be so. Her sanity was a threat to his control. The silence that followed was absolute. The narrative had been completely irrevocably shattered. Alistair Finch was not the savior. He was the disease. Catherine, sitting beside Isabella, closed her eyes, a silent tear of vindication rolling down her cheek. Judge Harrison looked down at Alistair, his expression one of utter disdain. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice cold as steel. "Do you have anything to say in response to this report?" "Not your lawyer." "You." Alistair Finch rose to his feet. All pretense was gone. His eyes, burning with a furious, narcissistic rage, were fixed on Catherine. "She did this," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "She was nothing when I found her. I gave her a life beyond her wildest dreams. I built an empire, and she repays me by turning my life into a circus, conspiring with this ambulance chaser." He pointed a shaking finger at Isabella. "You will all regret this. I will burn everything to the ground before I let her take it from me." It was the rant of a broken tyrant, a public confession of the very pathology Dr. Thorne had described. Judge Harrison banged his gavel with a resounding crack. "That is quite enough, Mr. Finch. I have heard all I need to hear." He looked at the court record, then at Catherine, his expression softening for the first time. "The petitioner's motion for conservatorship over Mrs. Catherine Finch is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, based on the evidence and testimony presented in these proceedings, particularly the appalling revelations in Dr. Thorne's report and Mr. Finch's own outburst just now, I am granting Mrs. Finch's counter-petition for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty. We will proceed with the division of assets at a later date, and I assure you, Ms. Rossi, this report will weigh heavily in those proceedings." He turned his gaze back to Alistair. "And Mr. Finch, I am issuing a temporary restraining order effective immediately. You will not come within 500 yards of Mrs. Finch. You will cease all contact and surveillance. If you violate this order, I will have you thrown in jail for contempt myself." We are adjourned. It was over. Alistair stood, stunned and exposed in the middle of the courtroom as reporters scrambled out to file their stories. He had walked in a king and would walk out a pariah. Catherine, guided by Isabella, walked past him without a glance. She was free. The unveiling was complete, and the truth in all its brutal clarity had finally come to light. The fallout from the courtroom unveiling was swift and catastrophic for Alistair Finch. The media which he had so skillfully manipulated turned on him with a ravenous ferocity. The headlines were brutal. Finch's Fall Psych Report reveals malignant narcissist. The billionaire's gilded cage inside the abuse of Catherine Finch. Aura dynamics in crisis as CEO's mental state questioned. The revelations of constant surveillance and psychological warfare didn't just make for salacious gossip. They struck at the heart of Alistair's business empire. Aura Dynamics built its reputation on security, data, integrity, and trust. How could the world trust a company with their most sensitive information when its own CEO secretly recorded his wife in their bedroom? The question was a contagion of doubt that spread through the market with blinding speed. Within 48 hours of Judge Harrison's ruling, Aura Dynamics' stock price had plummeted by 30%, wiping out billions in market capitalization. The board of directors, a group of powerful individuals who had long tolerated Alistair's arrogance in exchange for his genius, were now facing a shareholder rebellion. An emergency meeting was called at their headquarters. Alistair, barred by a restraining order from his own home, was forced to stay at a hotel under an assumed name. Watching his empire crumble on cable news. He tried to fight back, issuing a statement through a crisis PR firm that called the psychiatric report a fabrication and the court proceedings a miscarriage of justice. But his on-the-record tirade in the courtroom had been witnessed by dozens. The credibility he had spent a lifetime building had evaporated in a single moment of uncontrolled rage. The board, facing an existential threat to the company, voted unanimously to remove him as CEO and chairman. Alistair Finch, the visionary, had been exiled from his own kingdom. Meanwhile, Catherine was beginning to breathe again. The divorce settlement, fast-tracked by a horrified Judge Harrison, was more than generous, leveraging the psych report and the clear evidence of financial abuse. Isabella Rossi secured for Catherine not just her personal assets, but a significant portion of Alistair's own wealth, arguing it was compensation for years of emotional damage and the targeted sabotage of her potential career. But it was never about the money. It was about freedom. Catherine moved out of the Haven, the opulent prison, and bought a sun-filled brownstone in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. She reconnected with her family, who flew in from California to surround her with the unquestioning love she had been starved of for a decade. She called her old friends from Yale, who wept with her, and welcomed her back into their lives. She found Maria Torres, the housekeeper, who had given her the burner phone and provided her with a generous fund to start her own catering business. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first real untainted act of good she had been able to do in years. The most profound change was internal. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded her mind for so long began to lift. With the validation of the court and the support of her loved ones, she began to trust her own memories, her own perceptions again. She started seeing a therapist, one of her own, choosing to process the complex trauma of Alistair's abuse. 6 months later, Catherine announced the formation of the Haven Project, a foundation dedicated to providing legal aid, psychological support, and temporary housing for victims of coercive control and psychological abuse. She used her own story, her own name, Catherine Reed Finch, as a platform, transforming her pain into a public purpose. She gave the keynote speech she had practiced so long ago in the gardens of her prison, not at a small symposium, but at a national conference on domestic abuse. Her voice, once silenced, now resonated with power and authenticity, giving hope to countless others who were living in the same silent terror she had escaped. As for Alistair, his reckoning was one of quiet, pathetic isolation. He was left with his vast fortune, but his name was now synonymous with disgrace. He lived as a recluse in the cavernous, empty mansion, a place now stripped of its art, its life, and its purpose. The surveillance cameras he had installed to control others now only recorded his own lonely, paranoid existence. The staff was gone, replaced by a private security detail, who looked at him with contempt. The phone never rang. He had succeeded in burning everything to the ground, but he was the only one left in the ashes. A king of a silent, desolate kingdom of his own making. He had claimed his wife was mentally unfit, but in the end, the world saw that the true madness had been his all along. The story of Catherine and Alistair Finch is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous prisons aren't always made of bars and steel. Sometimes they're built from words manipulation and the quiet erosion of a person's reality. Catherine's fight for her sanity and her freedom shows the incredible courage it takes to speak truth to power, especially when that power is hiding in your own home. Her story is a testament to the fact that no matter how dark things seem, the truth has a power all its own, and a single brave voice can be enough to bring down an empire. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button to help it reach others who might need to hear it. Share it with your friends and on your social media. And for more true-life dramas and stories of incredible resilience, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for listening.